The president hoped to overcome that poor debate performance a couple of weeks ago and concerns about his mental acuity with a news conference last night at the close of the NATO summit. He did have some gaffes, but also showed strong command of key issues, particularly on foreign policy. Behind the scenes, though, advisors and close allies are said to be making the case for why he should step aside. We'll go through our new reporting from NBC News. Also on Capitol Hill, more Democratic lawmakers calling on the president to withdraw from the race over concerns he cannot defeat Donald Trump in November. Good morning. Welcome to Morning Joe. It is Friday, July 12th. I'm Willie Geist. With us, we have the host of Way Too Early, White House Bureau Chief at Politico, Jonathan Lemire, MSNBC contributor Mike Barnicle, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist and associate editor of the Washington Post, Eugene Robinson, and President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass. A great group assembled this morning. Our reporters coming in just a moment. Let's dive right into President Joe Biden's high-stakes press conference last night on the final day of this week's NATO summit in Washington. As more members of his own party call for him to exit the race, the president took questions from reporters for nearly an hour yesterday and gave no indication he plans to end his campaign. In fact, the contrary.
How the next 2 weeks go, will that affect your decision, or are you fully determined on running in November as the party's nominee?
I'm determined on running, but I think it's important that I allay fears by let them see me out there. I'm going to be going around making the case of the things that I think we have to finish and how we can't afford to lose what we've done or backslide on civil rights, civil liberties, women's rights. There's that little button we have. Control guns, not girls. I mean, the idea we're sitting around, this is where Kamala's so good as well. We're sitting around. More children are killed by a bullet than any other cause of death. The United States of America. What the hell are we doing? What are we doing? We got a candidate saying, promise the NRA, don't worry, I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to do anything. We got a Supreme Court that is what you might call the most conservative court in American history. This is ridiculous.
The presidency is the most straining job in the world, and it's 24/7. How can you say you'll be up for that next year, in 2 years, in 4 years, given the limits you've acknowledged that you have today?
The limits I've acknowledged I have?
There's been reporting that you've acknowledged that you need to go to bed earlier and your evening around 8.
That's not true. Look, what I said was, instead of my every day starting at 7 and going to bed at midnight, it'd be smarter for me to pace myself a little more. And I said, for example, the 8, 7, 6 stuff, instead of starting a fundraiser at 9 o'clock, start at 8 o'clock. People get to go home by 10 o'clock. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about, and if you looked at my schedule since I made that stupid mistake in the campaign, in the debate, I mean, my schedule has been full bore. I've done, where's Trump been? Riding around in his golf cart, filling out his scorecard before he hits the ball?
How can you reassure the American people that you won't have more bad nights, whether they be on a debate stage or on some matter of foreign policy?
Well, I tell you what, the best way to assure them is the way I assure myself. And that is, am I getting the job done? Am I getting the job done? Can you name me somebody who's gotten more major piece of legislation passed in 3.5 years? I created 2,000 jobs just last week. So if I slow down, I can't get the job done. That's a sign that I shouldn't be doing it. But there's no indication of that yet.
You earlier explained confidence in your vice president.
Yes.
If your team came back and showed you data that she would fare better against former President Donald Trump, would you reconsider your decision to stay in the race?
No, unless they came back and said, there's no way you can win. Me. No one's saying that. No poll says that.
The president last night, speaking for nearly an hour there at that press conference at the end of the NATO summit. So, Eugene Robinson, we did have a couple of more Democrats in the House come out just after that press conference and say that Joe Biden needed to step aside despite a performance that I think most people believe was obviously much, much better than the debate performance. You couldn't get much worse than that, but he looked and sounded better last night than he has recently. So what is your sense? Did that do anything to at least buy him some time? Did that do anything to change minds of people who were worried about him?
Well, you know, we'll see how much time it bought him. I mean, Congressman Jim Hines from Connecticut came out with his statement calling on President Biden to step aside minutes after the press conference ended. The press conference itself, I thought, was good. I mean, was affirmatively good for Biden in that he showed a mastery of foreign policy that he is exhibited for many years. Little flubs were the same flubs that Joe Biden has been making for 30, 40 years, nothing to see there. The problem, of course, is that he's trying to unring the bell that was rung in the debate. And that's a very difficult task. The other problem is that his numbers, you know, the Washington Post poll that came out yesterday showed him tied with Donald Trump nationally. That was kind of an outlier. Most of the polls, respectable polls, have him a bit behind. The average of polls has him 3 points behind. And in 2016 and in 2020, when we got to Election Day, Trump voters showed up who hadn't really been found by the pollsters. He did a bit better than predicted. 4 years ago at this point, Biden was ahead of Trump by 9 points. And so those are also data points that don't inspire a lot of confidence among Democrats, especially Democrats on the Hill who were worried about their own races.
So we had just actually a few moments ago, a new poll came out. We talked about that Washington Post poll yesterday that showed the president tied with former President Trump. This morning, it's an NPR Marist poll that shows Joe Biden up 2 points on Donald Trump in a national race. That's within the margin of error. Of course, though, the concern, Richard Haass, is in the swing states where Donald Trump has widened his lead a little bit in places that, frankly, that Joe Biden has to win. There's no option anymore. The margin of error is so small. He has to win places like Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Obviously, there's no other path to victory. You have called over the last couple of weeks, Richard, for the president to step aside to make way for another candidate because you don't believe that Joe Biden can beat Donald Trump and the stakes are too high. What did you make of what you saw last night? Did it do anything to change your mind?
Short answer is no, but let me tell you how I got there, Willie. I thought, like you all, the president did a really good job last night on foreign policy. That was a sophisticated, thoughtful, nuanced conversation of some really complex issues. Let's just say that very few people in public or private life could have sustained that kind of a conversation. The problem was, though, there were still some flubs, which people have focused on. He still comes off. The affect is still someone who's old. The voice is what it is. The walk is what it is. Also, foreign policy is not a subject that most Americans wake up ready to focus on. But I think he probably strengthened the odds, not settled it, but increased the odds he will be the candidate. But I think he's still got 5 weeks to the convention, so that pot still boils. The real question to me is, should he be the candidate? And there I still have doubts. I'll be honest with you. He can't do anything about the fact he's an incumbent in an era in which virtually every incumbent recently has lost. If you look again at India, South Africa, Britain, France, it's a very, very rough time to be an incumbent. The issues that have hurt him still hurt him, given the history of the border and immigration, given Gaza, even if we are perhaps getting near some progress there. Food prices are still higher than they were 3.5 years ago. And the age issue is just one that you can never, ever, ever put behind you 100%. He's always one flub away, one trip away. And if the whole goal is to make this a referendum on Donald Trump, I don't think he's there. And to me, I think other candidates on the Democratic side would be better positioned to make this a referendum on Donald Trump. I'm not sure how Joe Biden ever turns the corner. So this is not a referendum on him. And if it is a referendum on him, he's not going to be the next president of the United States.
You also, Carol, matched some reporting yesterday from the New York Times suggested the Biden campaign was quietly looking at head-to-head matchups with Kamala Harris, the vice president of the United States, against Donald Trump. What more can you tell us about that?
Well, this is the first time that they've done this sort of polling, and it obviously comes at a precarious time. The timing is pretty interesting. Now, what officials are saying is that they're doing this because former President Trump has started to attack the vice president, that it's based on that. But putting the vice president up against the former president in a hypothetical head-to-head matchup is a significant thing. And whatever that data shows, if you draw the line back to what President Biden said last night in his press conference, where he said, if he was asked if he was shown data that showed his vice president could beat former President Trump, would he reconsider? And he said he would look at data, and that if he was told that he couldn't win, then maybe he would consider dropping out. But nobody said that. All of that aside, the idea here is that this is something that's coming at a time when there are huge questions about whether the president's going to stay in the race. It's the president's own campaign doing that. I can tell you there are some frustrations that this got out. They don't like this. It's not a narrative that they want out there, but they're doing it.
Yeah, and just to add to Carol's excellent reporting, Willie, the polling about Vice President Harris, yes, could be interpreted as a hint and possible change at the top of the ticket. The other angle, though, and some have said, is that it could be to determine that Vice President Harris, per polling, wouldn't beat Donald Trump. And that would actually strengthen President Biden's argument to remain atop the ticket. And we know there are portions of the Biden inner circle that firmly believes the vice president can't do it, though they certainly feel like she has grown as a candidate in recent months, and they're a valuable ally. They're just not convinced that she can beat President Biden. And certainly there are President Trump, former President Trump, and there's certainly a number of Democrats and officials who do, and some even linked to the Biden campaign, who are openly questioning about whether or not he can continue. But to be clear, his immediate family and his inner circle, those advisors who make the big decisions around the president, they're all firmly convinced that he should stay in. And Willie, they still think he can win.
Yeah, and that's what we saw last night in that press conference. There was no wiggle room, at least last night, from the president about whether or not he's going to stay in the race. He's in, he says. So, Allie, let's swing up to Capitol Hill, the place you cover every day. The mood of Democrats, as we mentioned, a couple more Democratic defections yesterday from President Biden after the press conference saying it's time to move on. It's time for him to step aside and let's get Vice President Harris or a different candidate in there to beat Donald Trump. They say not because they don't admire and respect Joe Biden and his administration and the work he's done, but because they simply think he can't beat Donald Trump. So what else are you hearing in the hours after that press conference last night?
I think this conversation for the last 20 minutes hits on something that's so central to the main point on Capitol Hill, which is I haven't talked to anyone who's a staffer, who's an operative, who's an elected, who doesn't say some form of the sentence, I love Joe Biden, but. Those electability concerns are so palpable. This panic has been so protracted. There was just a real sense on the Hill yesterday, I think, of despair, both with the people who have come forward, like Senator Peter Welch, to say, I think he needs to step down, all the way to members who have privately expressed their concerns, but don't want to come forward publicly, either because they don't think that it's going to be persuasive to the president, so why bother, or because they just don't know if they're there yet. They have such concerns about who, if not Biden, can beat Donald Trump, because, again, all roads lead to Democrats stressing the need to avoid a second Trump presidency because of things like Project 2025, because of the role that Trump has played and takes credit for on stripping women of abortion protections and reproductive health care access. But I think what Congressman Jim Himes, the head of the Intel Committee, says when he explained why he came out in the minutes after that press conference, why he's coming out and saying Biden shouldn't be the nominee, this is part of what he says. And then there's one other thing he said that I noticed that I think is such an important piece. Listen here first.
I've been with the president on a number of occasions, and I have looked at those numbers. No president has ever been reelected with the disapproval ratings that our current president, love him as we do, has. And so I will not stand silent as I see a trajectory to an electoral loss that leads to the presidency of Donald Trump and all that he has promised. I've done a lot of political campaigns, Alex, and the one attribute of almost every single losing campaign, and I've seen hundreds of them, is that right up until the moment that the numbers are in and you've lost, you believe that you will win.
You guys also touched on this, and it's something that the congressman later said. It's the idea that everything that President Biden does between the debate and Election Day is going to be picked apart, scrutinized. Any mistake will be much more massive. And that's something that Congressman Himes said, this idea that you can't just jump from presidential appearance to presidential appearance with an entire party weighing whether or not this is the moment that they should all jump ship. And it's the question that I've been asking lawmakers. How much longer can you guys do this without utterly kneecapping the man who right now has decided he is your nominee? And I have to tell you, none of them have answered that question. I asked top Democratic House member Hakeem Jeffries yesterday, how much longer can you let your caucus continue to just air their grievances and drip by drip come out and say they don't think Biden should be the nominee? And he just said it's a constructive family conversation. That's been the line all week. But none of these lawmakers want to grade the president on a curve. And I can bet you voters don't either.
As we've been saying this week, Allie, this is people of good faith who want one thing in the Democratic Party, and that is to beat Donald Trump. Congressman Himes is a guy we respect a lot, obviously a very smart guy, comes on our show all the time. He doesn't believe Donald Trump can be defeated by President Biden. Others say, well, Joe Biden is the guy who beat Donald Trump, and he can do it again despite all the shortcomings that we see out in the open. So is there some moment, and who is the person? Is it Hakeem Jeffries? Is it Nancy Pelosi? Is it former President Obama behind the scenes? Are there meetings? Are there conversations? Is there a moment where the party comes together and said, this is our decision, this is the plan? We're either standing with the president or the vast majority of us believe he should step aside. Does that moment ever come?
It really needs to, but I think the goalposts and the timeline keeps moving because first it was, all right, his first appearance after the debate. Let's see how that goes. Then it was the Stephanopoulos interview. Then it became, let's see how the press conference goes last night. Now it's become, all right, well, the RNC, the Republican convention is next week. Democrats come back to the Hill. Certainly by then, if Democrats haven't said all they need to say by then we'll have to see what happens. There is this moving goalpost and this moving metric. And I think the thing that's so hard is it's an unquantifiable thing. Every lawmaker that I have talked to, I have asked the same question that you're asking me, which is, OK, when you say do more, what does that mean? When you need to see something, what does that look like? And there's no tangible answer to this because really what you're solving for here is vibes, mood. People don't feel good. There is such a sense of despair that has been hanging over the Capitol as I've been working the halls the last few days. And that is not something that you can solve by data. It's not something that makes it. It's a feeling. It's not a fact, right? And so I think that's what people are looking for. And I have to say, I mean, you look at the fact that top Biden campaign officials went to Capitol Hill to meet with very nervous senators yesterday. And I know senators left that meeting saying, oh, well, they asked us not to leak. We're not going to give details. But the only thing that we did end up hearing about was the fact that it got heated when it came to pressing the Biden officials on what a path forward looks like. And I can tell you, I mean, we all know the way that lawmakers work. If that meeting had gone really well, they would have said that it went really well. And that's not what we heard in the halls. There were people who said, yes, I felt good going in, or I was a little nervous going in. I feel a little bit better now. The reality is this race was always going to be close. It sort of feels, honestly, like 2020, when all I heard from voters was, OK, I just want the best person to beat Trump, the best person to beat Trump. Biden got the benefit of the doubt on that, and it's open to see whether or not he gets it again here.
And the truth is, no one knows what happens.
And you can't know.
Both ways are a gamble. Staying with President Biden might be a gamble. The unknown, obviously, is a gamble. NBC's Ali Vitale and Carol Lee, outstanding reporting as usual from both of you. Thanks so much for being here this morning.
Should the conversation about the president getting out of this race, should that conversation continue?
No, it shouldn't.
The conversation should be over.
No, the conversation should focus on the record of this administration, on the alternative to his election, and let Joe Biden continue to make his own decisions about his future. He's earned that right, and I am going to give him that much respect. If he decides to change his mind later on, then we would respond to that. We have until the 19th of August to open our convention. And so I would hope that we would spend our time now focusing on the record that we will lay out for the American people.
Congressman Jim Clyburn a few moments ago talking to our friends at the Today Show. So, Rev, you just mentioned Jim Clyburn. He also went on to say, quote, "I hope we will focus on the substance of this man instead of the sometimes misspoken words and phrases, and let's focus on how he has run the country." Obviously, James Clyburn's voice is an incredibly influential one in Democratic politics. What did you make of what he said there?
I think that it's going to have a lot of impact, not only with black voters, but a lot of voters. Jim Clyburn helped bring Joe Biden to the dance. As I said, he'll be on my show Saturday night. And I think that if he took a different position, it would be devastating to the president. But I also think that people understand Clyburn knows the difference between hype and reality. The reality is that President Biden has done a stellar record in the concerns of most Americans, and he has earned the right to get the benefit of the doubt that is being raised by some people who are calling on him to step aside. I think that clearly the strongest points I saw him make last night, and I thought it was a strong press conference for him, is he wants to finish the job. And who was the job for? The job was for people that had been neglected, if not devastated, by 4 years of Donald Trump. And those of us that wanted to see that job turned around that Trump did on us to a job that Biden did for us, will be inclined to want to see that job be finished.
A new piece in The Atlantic takes readers behind the scenes of Donald Trump's re-election campaign. Staff writer Tim Alberta spoke with campaign co-managers Chris LaCivita and Susie Wiles at different points over the past 2 months. It details those discussions in a new piece titled "Trump is Planning for a Landslide Win." Tim joins us now. Tim, good morning. It's good to see you. So you, as usual, did a deep dive here, spent about 6 months talking to the people running the campaign. You now say they are preparing for a landslide win. Why do you say that?
Hey, good morning, Willie. Thanks for having me. You know, what's really interesting is that from the opening moments of my opening conversations with Chris LaCivita and Susie Wiles, it became really clear that their confidence about this race was rooted in Joe Biden, not in Donald Trump. In other words, they had begun to conceptualize a campaign here that was really built around running a very specific race against a very specific opponent in Joe Biden. And what they've done over these past 6 months or so is really try to optimize the campaign against Joe Biden. Everything they've done in terms of messaging, everything that they've done in terms of budgeting, all of their targeting of voters, all of the internet memes they're creating, everything that they are doing as a campaign has really been built around not beating a generic Democrat, but beating Biden and attacking his very particular vulnerabilities. And so when you suddenly in these last couple of weeks have a realization inside the Trump campaign that Biden could be getting out, whether it's Kamala Harris or anyone else replacing him at the top of the ticket, it has sent a chill through the Trump campaign because they recognize that their own candidate is deeply flawed and deeply unpopular, but they felt as though they had basically boxed Biden in and were in a position where they were getting ready to run the table across the battleground states and win a very, very solid and maybe even sort of resounding victory in the Electoral College because they didn't think that Joe Biden would be able to recover from the position that he was in.
You know, we've seen in recent days former President Trump attacking Vice President Harris, perhaps anticipating that if there is a change, she would be at the top of the ticket. He projects confidence about a race against her, but are they actually as confident as they sound about the potential for running against Kamala Harris?
You know, I'm not sure that they are, Willie. They told me, Trump's campaign managers said, look, you know, any Democrat who replaces Biden at the top of the ticket is going to inherit his baggage. You know, we're going to attack all the same weaknesses. That person is going to have all the same vulnerabilities. But again, I would just stress that so much of what they've built this campaign around is basically a machine to contrast the visuals of sort of Trump's, you know, virility and machismo, and he can do press conferences or he can do rallies for an hour and a half, and versus Biden and his debate performance, all of the sort of viral memes that they're creating, all of the mailers that they're doing, the television spots that they've already begun to conceptualize, they're all going to be focused on Biden's age and his capacities. They can't do that with Kamala Harris. It's a very different situation. And they also recognize that some of the targeting of voters that they have been planning would have to necessarily change if Kamala Harris were at the top of the Democratic ticket. So there is just fundamentally sort of a strategic and tactical reset if Biden is not their opponent.
Tim, this is a smart and deeply reported piece. I'm just shocked, frankly, that you got the access, because part of the superpower of these two campaign managers, Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita, is that they don't talk to the press on the record, and they haven't been out there publicly as the face of the campaign. How and why did they give you so much access?
Well, at the risk of giving away any of my secrets, I think I would just say that, you know, once these folks realize that you're going to be able to get to everyone else and talk to everyone else and find out, frankly, the things that they don't want you to find out, then they start to realize it's probably in their best interest to cooperate and participate and try to at least you know, control some piece of the narrative to the extent that they're able. So, you know, I had spent quite a bit of time already sort of tunneling into Trump world and knew a lot of the other people involved and had a pretty good sense of what was going on. And so when I came to them and said, listen, I think it's probably in your best interest just to have these conversations with me yourselves on the level, they ultimately agreed.
Tim, in this piece for The Atlantic, it's an incredible piece of reporting. You write, in part, they would be, talking about Chris and Susie, they would be remembered for running a campaign that altered the nation's political DNA. And you also write that you were struck by their arrogance. Talk about that.
Yeah, look, we've come off consecutive presidential elections. You know, in 2016, Donald Trump wins the presidency by a combined 77,744 votes in 3 states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. 4 years later, Joe Biden wins the presidency by a combined 42,918 votes across 3 states. And I think we're just expecting, all of us, that this would be yet another cliffhanger here in 2024. But the Trump people from day one have operated under a very different theory. Chris LaCivita and Susie Wiles looked at these last 2 Trump campaigns and recognized that they were, in many ways, clown shows. I mean, they were not well managed. They were not well budgeted. There was not sort of a unified theory of how to attack his opponent. These are 2 very, very smart and shrewd political operators, and frankly, they are both cutthroat political operators. These are people who know how to win elections, and what they saw from day one was an opportunity to paint Joe Biden in such a devastating, debilitating light that they would not just be squeaking by in the Electoral College, but that they would be winning comfortably in the Electoral College, and that they would be even winning the popular vote, something Republicans have only done once in the last 8 tries. And what was interesting to see, you guys, is that over the last couple of months, as they saw their plan beginning to really sort of take form and the polls were shifting and it was clear that what they were doing was working, they went from feeling sort of confident about their ability to win big. They suddenly got pretty cocky about it, and they started talking openly, using words like landslide and blowout in some of our conversations.
And those are words that political operatives usually do not use in public. Willie, we should also just note that maybe this time will be different. But in the past, Donald Trump has not reacted well when his aides, when his advisors suddenly get the spotlight, when they get the attention. It's not just that he got furious at Steve Bannon for outshining him. He got angry at his own son-in-law, Jared Kushner, when he's starting to get a lot of media attention. So we'll have to see if there's any blowback here for Chris LaCivita and Susie Wiles.
Yeah, that's a good point. He doesn't like profiles of other people, certainly not people on the cover of magazines other than himself. The new piece is online for The Atlantic. It's titled, Trump is Planning for a Landslide Win. Tim, Alberta, thanks so much as always. We appreciate it. Susan Glasser, your new piece online this morning for The New Yorker is titled, Joe Biden's less than awful press conference does not mean everything is now okay. And a little bit tongue-in-cheek with the headline there, but it makes the point that a lot of people have made, which is less than awful should not be the standard for the man holding the most powerful job on the face of the earth. So what are you hearing about the way forward here after last night's press conference?
Well, that's right. You started with the observation that the bar has been set so very low. And I think in many ways this press conference is a preview of what the campaign looks like from here on in for Democrats as long as Joe Biden remains at the top of their ticket, which is to say every public appearance is going to be accompanied by, sort of holding your breath, wondering how he's going to do. Are we just one gaffe away from, a whole new round of recriminations and fears around Biden's viability? Because I think, to John's point, this is not about any individual appearance anymore. It's about the numbers. It's about the view of an increasing number of serious Democrats, people who should be taken seriously, who believe that Biden is not in a position to win. Remember, that debate was called for by the Biden campaign itself because they were not identifiably winning against Donald Trump. They wanted to change the dynamic. Well, they changed the dynamic in that they're now having a conversation in the middle of the summer of an election year about shoring up their own nervous Democrats. They're speaking still to the Democratic base rather than being able to look to how do I assemble a winning coalition in 2024? How do I persuade not just core Democrats, but independents and even some Republicans, the people who elected Biden in 2020? They're the ones who aren't convinced. And Biden really isn't even speaking to them right now. And I think that's the cost and the consequence of this ongoing internal fight among the Democrats.
And Rev, that's the point, isn't it? That this isn't just about passing performance tests. It's the deep-seated concern that Joe Biden cannot win based on his performance, based on his age, based on the perception that he is too old to have the job. And that's what you're hearing from Democrats who, again, like and admire Joe Biden, think he's done a great job as president, appreciate his service. They just look out on the horizon and they say, if he goes down, he may take us down with him. The Senate, the House, open that up to perhaps Supreme Court seats down the road. There is deep concern, and I know you're hearing it too, that Joe Biden could lose it all for Democrats.
I'm hearing it, yes, but I'm also hearing not so fast, because if not Biden, then how do we do a transition that doesn't put us in a more dangerous position? I was in Milwaukee yesterday doing a eulogy for a black man that was killed by some hotel guards, and people there in the uproar about that are saying to me, and you cannot win Wisconsin without Milwaukee and black turnout. And they were saying to me, well, we got questions about Biden's age, but where do we go? And are they going to try to undermine Kamala Harris? So I think that if we're talking a coalition, you've got to remember the basic roots of that coalition, black, Latinos, and labor. You can't just take for granted we're going to go where some people just want to go and abandon someone who's been with us. I looked at the press conference last night and said, where are the black reporters? We're looking at all whites questioning Biden, and black voters supposed to just get in line. So I think that a lot of the people that are stepping out there taking things for granted. You notice that maybe only one member of the Congressional Black Caucus has even said Biden ought to step aside. Congressman Jim Clyburn is going to be on Politics Nation with me on tomorrow night. I'm going to be guided a lot by what he has to say. Don't forget, it was the stonewall of the black vote and then the Latino vote that put Biden in nomination. And for us to be out of these discussions, I think is offensive and elitist.
And we should note the White House is the one who determined which reporters got questions yesterday.
That's who I was addressing, was the White House.
So, Michael Schmidt, no doubt campaign aides, Democrats, White House officials feel better this morning. But to the point around this conversation, it's unclear what last night's news conference really changed for the big picture for the party. And you were part of a team that had reporting that emerged before the news conference about how some Biden advisors, maybe not the closest advisors, but some Biden advisors are actually having quiet conversations about how to gently steer the president out of the race. Tell us about it.
Yeah, and he sort of nodded to some of these issues last night in his press conference. But what these aides have basically come to the conclusion of is that he does have to step aside, and that to do that, they have to convince him of the need to do that. And the biggest thing that they face is basically showing and telling him and convincing him that he cannot win. And he is someone who has become even more entrenched in that view since the debate. Before the debate, he thought that he had a far better chance than his vice president of beating Trump, and that has not changed. And that puts this story truly in a standoff. It's a standoff between a president and his party. As we saw in minutes after the press conference was over last night, Jim Himes, someone, a fairly reasonable member of the House, someone who sees the world very similarly to a lot of other House members, comes out and says that basically, as you were saying, regardless of that press conference, he has to go. It's because of the poll numbers. I think there's also a deep frustration amongst these Democrats that they're not talking about these accomplishments, that they did have an enormous amount of accomplishments over the past few years, but instead, folks like myself who aren't doctors are on television sort of breaking down performances, saying, he stumbled three names and, tonight, and I guess that was better than 2 weeks ago, but he was good on, we're not talking about the accomplishments, and we're not talking about Donald Trump. And one more thing that I wanted to add is that I've talked to one of the 17 that has broken, and what he said to me was actually pretty interesting. He said, I didn't know what the reaction was going to be from my constituents when I did this. I didn't have polling, I didn't have anything, scientific or mathematical to tell me what it's going to be. I just sort of went with what I thought. And he said that the reaction had been 80-20. 80% of his constituents, he said, based on his feel, were okay with it, and they thought that he had done the right thing. And he was a bit surprised by that, I think, because he thought he was taking a risk. He didn't know what it was going to be, and the backlash was less than he thought. It's just one congressman. It's just one example, but it's someone who has lived through the decision of coming out publicly against the president.
By the way, Rev invoked James Clyburn's name, one of the most respected congressmen in the Democratic Congress. He said this week, quote, "We are riding with Biden." So there you have it from Jim Clyburn. Said they're standing behind the president. Let's bring joining us now, former White House Chief of Staff for President Biden, Ron Klain. Ron, good morning. It's good to have you with us. So I'm reading your message this morning that you posted. You write, quote, "It's time to end the freak out and unite behind the Democratic nominee and the only person who has ever beaten Trump." What did you see in that press conference? What are you seeing in polls? You're talking about a poll in this tweet. The NPR poll that we mentioned earlier shows Joe Biden up 2 points within the margin of error on Donald Trump. Also reflective of the Washington Post poll that showed them tied at 46 yesterday. Of course, that's a national poll. But what do you see in these numbers that make you think Joe Biden should stay in the race?
Well, look, I think he should stay in the race because he is the nominee of the Democratic Party. We had a democratic process. Voters all across the country went and voted in primary after primary, and they voted to renominate Joe Biden as the leader of the Democratic ticket. I think this isn't like some soccer game where some shadowy group of people on the sidelines get to run new players out onto the field at the last minute. The donors don't get to decide. The voters decided. And since the debate, we've had unprecedented support from grassroots donors across the country, pouring millions of dollars into the campaign. The president has broad support across the country, and I think he is the right person to take on Donald Trump. He's the only person in either party who's ever beaten Trump. I think there's a reason for that, because what he stands for, his support for working people, his working class roots, those are unique assets he brings to the race, and I think he will continue to bring those assets to the race, and I think he will beat Trump this fall.
As we said earlier and been saying all along over the last couple of weeks, Ron, there are people of good faith in the Democratic Party who really like and respect Joe Biden, who are concerned about his age. And that's a reasonable argument. It's a reasonable criticism that they worry not just about whether he can win, but his ability to serve over the next 4 years at his age. What do you say to those people who are not abandoning Joe Biden at this point, but who are deeply concerned about what they saw at the debate and what they may see over the next 4 years? What do you tell them?
Well, I told him, look at the press coverage yesterday. You saw the president's command of policy issues around the world, his detailed explanation of how NATO is working to try to prevent China from supplying Russia, his explanation of, and you just look at his performance as president. He's brought NATO together. It's larger than ever before, more border with Russia than ever before, to contain Russian aggression in Ukraine and keep it from spreading to the west of Europe. In the Middle East, he organized a coalition of a number of nations, including Arab states, to repel Iran's attack on Israel when Iran launched a ballistic missile attack on Israel. And so I think his functioning in the job, and I think the explanations of the policy issues he gave last night show that he's up to the job, show that he's capable of governing and has unique skills. You hear what the NATO leaders said coming out of the NATO summit yesterday. You saw what Chancellor Scholz said. It's a mistake to underestimate Joe Biden. And President Macron also reiterated that President Biden is doing a great job as President of the United States. So I think the people in the room with him see him leading the world, see him leading NATO. And I think the American people could see it last night in that press conference as he went through policy issues, domestic issues, and international issues, and explained his plans, his agenda, and what he will do what it will do in the future.
Hey, Ron, good morning. Jonathan Lemire. That NPR poll, largely positive for President Biden, does also contain this crosstab that 36% of those surveyed think that Joe Biden, President Biden, has the mental fitness to serve, while 50% think Donald Trump does. And certainly the Republicans and Trump himself have been hammering on this issue for years. How does the Biden campaign combat something that feels so baked in right now?
Well, I think that, again, it's hard to reconcile that with the fact that most voters in that poll thought Joe Biden should be reelected president. So, I think that his fitness to serve is proven by him serving, and his serving with excellence and distinction, and continuing to lead the world, combating Russian aggression in Ukraine, bringing down prices here at home, doing more to grow the economy, create jobs. I think, the proof that he can be president is that he is president, and I think that's the fundamental metric.
So, Ron, obviously the Biden campaign is desperate to turn the page on that debate and get back to drawing contrasts with Donald Trump. And it helps their cause that Trump's about to be in the spotlight again. We anticipate he's going to name his VP choice at any time. There's some rumors it could come tomorrow at his rally in Pennsylvania. And, of course, the convention, the Republican convention, starts Monday. What should we be looking for? What should Americans take from Donald Trump these next few days?
Well, look, I think that you're going to see the Republicans try to run from and hide their Project 2025 agenda. But Trump's fingerprints are all over it. It's his people. It's his plan. And American people can go, as President Biden said yesterday on social media, they should Google Project 2025 and understand what's in that, what Trump would do if he became president. They're also going to see the Republicans speaking at the convention, and they'll see the MAGA-ness of the Republican Party. And I think that in and of itself will be a setback for the Trump campaign. And look, it's time for Democrats to stop agonizing and start mobilizing. We're on the verge of the Republican convention. It's a time for us to come together as a party, unite behind our nominee, and proceed to get ready for the fall election.
Ron, all of this concern, all these questions over the last 2 weeks stem from the debate performance that the president had against Donald Trump on the 27th of June. You were involved in preparing him for that debate. What can you say about the man you worked with in the week leading up to the debate and the man you saw on the stage? Was that an aberration to you? Were you surprised by what you saw in the debate? Because that really is what a lot of voters are trying to sort through.
Look, I thought, as the president said, he had a bad night. His practices were better, and he was tired from all the back and forth travel around the world, and was suffering from a cold that really constrained his voice and constrained his ability to be forceful in the debate. And he was trying not to lose his voice, it was very scratchy and very impacted by his cold. But the president is absolutely sharp, fit, on top of his game. People can see that for themselves. You don't have to take my word for it. People could see that for themselves last night in the press conference. We saw in the press conference last night was much more typical of what we saw in the debate preparations. And, I worked for President Obama. We had a horrible debate, the first debate in Denver in 2012. And, I think that, sometimes presidents have bad debates. And I promise you we'll have a better second debate. And, I think that the president showed what he's capable of last night in this press conference. And the voters see it every day as he governs, leads the country in campaigns around the country.
Ron, can you see, though, why the idea that the president of the United States couldn't perform almost 2 weeks after he got home from Europe in a 90-minute debate might reinforce the questions that people have about his ability to do the job?
No, because, look, I think, Willie, you see him doing the job, and you just saw him get through this grueling week of NATO meetings with NATO leaders saying he did an excellent job, with the NATO producing the Ukraine declaration at the end of it, new breakthrough for NATO, and it's confronting Russian aggression. I mean, the measure of him being president is being president. We're not hiring a debater-in-chief. We're hiring a commander-in-chief, someone to lead our economy here at home, lead our domestic policy, stand up for freedom around the world, stand for freedom here at home in the face of the Republicans trying to roll back women's rights. And I think that people see Joe Biden doing that. And I think that's the measure of his fitness to be president, is the way he is president.
Finally, Ron, the national polls we looked at that are head-to-head, neck and neck within the margin of error the last 2 days do show some strength for President Biden. There have been questions and concerns since the debate about the battleground state polls. We should point out he's still running effectively within the margin of error in the states that really will decide the election, which are Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. So what can you tell voters about what you all see happening inside those battleground states?
Look, it's a close election. I said that a year ago. I said it would be a very close election right till the very end. It's going to be a close election right till the very end. And I agree, it's close in those states, close in Pennsylvania, close in Michigan, close in Wisconsin. He was in Wisconsin recently. He's going out to Michigan, and he obviously campaigns in Pennsylvania regularly. And we're going to continue to fight hard in those states. And I think Joe Biden is uniquely suited to those states. He has identified with working people. He has the support of the auto workers, which are critical in those states. And he's brought manufacturing jobs back to those states. After decades of those states losing manufacturing jobs is on the increase in the industrial heartland of our country for the first time in a long time, thanks to the policies that President Biden has put in place, his advocacy for working people. So I think the man from Scranton is the right person to take on the man from Mar-a-Lago. I think this is the contrast we want in this race. I think it's a contrast that's going to inure to Joe Biden's benefit. And in the end, he will win those 3 states as he did in 2020 and win other states as well, of course.
And the president out on the road again today. Former White House Chief of Staff for President Biden, Ron Klain. Ron, thanks so much for your time this morning. We appreciate it. Today, governors from across the country will gather in Salt Lake City for the second day of the National Governors Association summer meeting. State leaders meet twice a year to discuss how they can better work together across party lines. Today's meeting will feature a discussion with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He will be there in person in Salt Lake City to address officials there. Joining us now, the incoming chair of the National Governors Association, Colorado's Democratic Governor Jared Polis, and the group's incoming vice chair, Oklahoma's Republican Governor Kevin Stitt. Governors, it's great to have you with us this morning. Governor Polis, I'll start with you and what you expect to hear from President Zelensky, who's making the extraordinary step of flying across the United States west to Salt Lake City to be with you all before returning home to Ukraine.
Well, he certainly brings some star power to our gathering of governors. But look, governors have a strong interest in protecting and preserving the global order. We're open for investment in Colorado. I know Oklahoma is too. And governors are often effectively ambassadors for economic development in our states. And I know on behalf of Ukraine, on behalf of defending Europe, in Colorado, we, in the early days of the war, collected over 800 bulletproof vests from law enforcement agencies donated them to Ukraine. And I know a lot of other states are strongly supportive of making sure we can defend our European allies. Of course, it's a moral imperative, defending democracy, but frankly, it's also good for economic development. Europe is our largest trading partner. Making sure that we have a peaceful, prosperous Europe is very much not only in the American interest, but in the interest of all 50 states. And I think governors feel very strongly that way, and we're looking forward to the discussion.
I note that also joining today, along with President Zelensky in a different session, Matthew McConaughey. That's some lineup you guys have today. So, Governor Stitt, let me ask you, what is at the top of the agenda as you all sit together? Again, Democrats and Republicans from states across the country. What are you hearing most from governors and from the people in your state?
Yeah, thanks. The governors, the NGA, we get together in a bipartisan effort to really work on real solutions, and the solutions happen at the state level. And so as governors, we have a unique perspective of we just have to get work done. And so I tell Oklahomans all the time, and I'm sure in Colorado the same thing. I mean, we want the best education system for our kids. We want the best roads and bridges, best health care, and then the best economy. I want Oklahoma to be the most business-friendly state in the country. And so really, the governors can work together in a bipartisan effort to really get projects done. I mean, that's why we talk about permitting reform. When you talk about all the investments and the infrastructure investments that need to be done, we need to get permitting reform done. So governors just have a unique perspective. We really work in a bipartisan effort. And so I think that America really likes when a Democrat governor and a Republican governor can sit together and talk about real issues in a bipartisan way.
Well, let's further that conversation about working together in a bipartisan way. You're right. Governors do it. Mayors do it. But it so often doesn't happen on the federal level. So question to both of you, Governor Stitt, you first. Just how much harder is your job when there's dysfunctioning partisan gridlock in Washington?
Yeah, I mean, it makes it tough. I mean, we see it just like all of America does, that there's not a lot of stuff getting done in Washington, D.C., and there just seems like they're playing politics. There's make-sense solutions. We talk about an all-of-the-above approach in Oklahoma on energy. We have to let American companies innovate. We need to stop. We need to stop being so partisan and literally just try to meet the needs of Americans, reduce inflation by unleashing American dominance in energy, and that's oil and natural gas. That's also wind development. That's nuclear. That's hydrogen, and that's the way we approach it in Oklahoma. So we can have honest conversations about that. But it is frustrating when you don't see much being done at the national level, and it's an election year, and we get that, and a lot of politics, and people are driven to their corners. But I think most America are, center right, center left, and we can have honest conversations about what's the direction. But we want to make sure that the American dream is alive and well for that next generation. That's what governors are focused on.
Governor Polis?
What brings Matthew McConaughey to Salt Lake City to join us here is this discussion of disagree better. It's really about how can governors not only be effective problem solvers in our states, which we are every day. There's no Republican or Democratic way to fill a pothole. We all care about our schools, about educational opportunity, about powering our economy. But it's also how can we model a better form of civil discourse, where it doesn't mean people shouldn't disagree. Disagreement is healthy for democracy. That's what democracy is all about. But how can we do it in a way that leads to a better outcome in a constructive way rather than this politics of personal destruction? So that's something that the governors have been leading on. We've been working with the outgoing chair, the Utah governor of our host state here, Spencer Cox. And there's a lot of excitement on both sides of the aisle towards not only leading in our states, but collectively coming together so governors can set a positive example for the country.
Governor Polis, before I let you go, I know you as a Democrat are hearing what Democrats across the country are talking about and hearing, and that is questions around President Biden. Do you support his staying in the presidential race?
Well, look, as as a Democrat, as Republicans, we all have our candidates, and I feel like most Democrats do. We want to win this. We want to protect American democracy, protect freedom, and I think what's clear is something needs to change to win that, right? Whether that's the message, whether that's the strategy, whether that's the candidate, show us the path to victory. And I know that let's elevate the discussion and have a great discussion over the differences of the candidates and get out of the basement politics of personal destruction and let the best person win.
Do you think President Biden gives Democrats the best chance to win?
Well, I think clearly he's made some missteps over the last few weeks, and I think the question is not so much what I think, it's what the American people think, and they need to change something up. Again, whether it's his strategy, whether it's his message, I fundamentally think his policies are good for America. And while of course I have my disagreements with both candidates, I have full confidence, and I think it's really an issue of making sure that he can show to the American people that he's ready, not just what he's accomplished the last 4 years, but he is ready with a positive vision for America's future for the next 4 years to make life better for every American family.
Incoming chair of the National Governors Association, Democratic Governor Jared Polis of Colorado, and incoming vice chair, Republican Governor Kevin Stitt of Oklahoma, welcoming President Zelensky and, yes, Matthew McConaughey to Salt Lake City today. Governors, thanks for your time this morning. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.